It's 6:40 in the morning on Michigan Avenue, and the light hits the Hyatt sign before it hits anything else. A doorman in a wool coat is already holding the door for someone he'll never see again. Cabs idle at the curb. A suitcase rattles across wet pavement. Somewhere, somebody is late for a flight none of us will ever hear about. Nobody looks up at the building. Why would they? It's a hotel. You've probably stayed in one just like it, in a city that wasn't this one, and never once thought about who signs off on the light bulbs. But that's the useful thing about ordinary places. They hide power in plain sight, because the family behind that sign did not stop at hotels. They own pieces of this city you've probably touched without knowing it. The industrial space your package moved through, the hospital wing someone in your family has walked into, maybe the office building where somebody does your taxes right now. Not because it's secret, because it's boring enough that nobody bothers to say it out loud all at once. So let's say it out loud. The origin. Every quiet empire starts with one loud bet. For this family, that bet begins with a man. He inherited a law degree, an eye for overlooked opportunities, and the habit of noticing what other people walked past. The basic thesis was simple, and at the time it sounded almost too simple to matter. Business travelers did not need romance. They needed efficiency. A clean room, a reliable shower, an airport nearby, a place to disappear for one night and leave before sunrise. So he bought a motel near an airport at a price other people thought was absurd. And the reason the price looked absurd is the same reason so many fortunes start. Most people were evaluating what it was. He was evaluating what it could become. That motel became a chain. That chain became Hyatt. And Hyatt became the part of the empire ordinary people could recognize from the street. That's the pattern to keep in your head for the rest of this story. The visible part is rarely the real size. The sign is the clue. The holdings are the story. Because once a family learns how to build predictable cash flow around ordinary human movement, sleeping, traveling, shipping, leasing, healing, storing, parking, transacting, it stops thinking in terms of businesses and starts thinking in systems. And systems scale more quietly than brands do. What the public record actually shows if you go looking for the family behind Hyatt. The interesting part is not hidden in some cinematic vault. It's in filings, property records, corporate disclosures, foundation pages. The kind of paperwork nobody reads unless they're paid to. And when you start adding it up, the pattern gets clearer. Yes, there's the hotel legacy, the thing everybody already knows. But around that visible brand sits something less glamorous and more durable. Capital spread across industries that don't need attention to make money. Real estate, industrial assets, healthcare exposure, manufacturing investments, private equity positions, infrastructure-adjacent businesses. The practical skeleton of a city, not the skyline version of wealth. The plumbing version, the package warehouse, matters more than the penthouse in a lot of balance sheets. It just photographs worse. That's what makes families like this hard to mentally map. People imagine wealth as yachts, penthouses, and football teams. Sometimes it is, but old wealth, disciplined wealth, infrastructure wealth, that often looks like distribution corridors, office blocks, service properties, and long-term operating stakes in businesses most people would never click on voluntarily. And once you understand that, the city starts looking different. The hotel isn't just a hotel. It's proof of concept. The hospital wing with the family name on it isn't just philanthropy. It's also evidence of social permanence. The kind of permanence that makes a family name feel less like an owner and more like part of the architecture. The political footprint matters too. In this case, that family name crossed out of business pages and into public office. One member became governor, which means the surname became culturally visible in a way family office money usually doesn't. And that creates an illusion, because once the public has a familiar narrative, hotel family, rich family, political family, it often stops asking the next question. Rich from what, exactly? And how much of the city sits somewhere inside that answer? That's the part people rarely total up. And be careful with the wording when you do, Because the number is not the point. The point is structural. This is not a story about one flashy company creating one generation of wealth. It's a story about wealth learning how to detach itself from headlines and attach itself to systems that keep working whether anybody notices them or not. That's a very different kind of power. And this is where the story gets a little uncomfortable. Not because it's criminal, not because it's secret, because it's normal. Nobody in this story has to be a villain for the pattern to matter. What matters is the gap between what gets attention and what gets money. The startup gets the profile piece. The founder gets the podcast interview. The luxury tower gets the drone shot. But the unglamorous asset, the warehouse, the service property, the quiet operating company, the boring long lease, gets almost none of that. And still, year after year, those are often the things compounding in the background with the least interruption. That's the part most people miss when they picture wealth. Fortunes are not always built where culture is looking. They are often built where culture is too bored to look twice. This is not uniquely a Chicago story. Chicago just makes the pattern easier to see because the contrast is so clean. A famous sign, a famous family name, and beneath it, a much less famous web of ownership that reaches further than the brand most people stop at. Why nobody talks about IT, so why isn't this common knowledge? Not because somebody successfully erased it, because three things are happening at once. First, boring doesn't trend. A warehouse lease will never compete with a celebrity breakup. An industrial park acquisition does not become dinner table conversation unless you already work in that world. Most of the assets that stabilize wealth are narratively dead on arrival. Second, the visible business absorbs all the oxygen. Once the public has a front-facing symbol, Hyatt, in this case, the rest of the family's footprint disappears behind it. People think they know the story because they know the logo. And knowing the logo feels close enough to knowing the structure that most people never push further. Third, ownership at this scale is usually layered, not in a sinister way, in a normal way. Holding companies, investment vehicles, trusts, family offices, partnerships, foundation relationships, entities designed for governance, taxes, liability, succession, and control. All legal, all common, all documented somewhere, but functionally invisible to anybody who isn't specifically trying to reconstruct the map. And that may be the most important point in the whole video. Quiet wealth is usually not hidden. It's just filed under names you would never think to search. That's a different problem. Secrecy makes people suspicious. Administrative complexity makes people give up. And giving up is often all the privacy power ever needs. What this really says about cities, once you notice this pattern, you start noticing it everywhere. Every city has a public version of itself. The restaurants, the towers, the hotels, the headlines. And then it has an ownership version of itself. The ownership version is quieter, less photogenic, more repetitive. It lives in property records, endowments, pension allocations, private funds, land assemblages, logistics corridors, and entity names that sound like law firms or office parks. The public city is what you consume. The ownership city is what compounds. And most people spend their whole lives inside the second one, without ever seeing its outline. That's why families like this matter as a subject, not because they're uniquely mysterious, but because they are not. They're a clean example of a much bigger rule. If a fortune survives long enough, it stops performing wealth and starts organizing terrain. So the next time you walk through a hotel lobby that feels a little too polished for the price, or drive past an industrial park you've never once wondered about, it's worth pausing for half a second. Not because every boring building hides a billionaire, but because the ones that do almost never announce it. They don't need to. The sign out front is for the public. The rest of the city is the balance sheet. And if you want to know which family quietly owns, that's the next map we're drawing. Subscribe, and next time we do this, we're picking a different skyline.